Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. Every month, we invite an expert to enlighten us on a topic related to our mission. Because Village TV videotapes these presentations, we can share that expertise with a larger audience. We hope you enjoy today's broadcast.
Tonight's speaker, DeSipio, is not a new face in Laguna Woods. He has presented here several times, and Concerned Citizens is delighted to host him again. At UCI, he is professor in the Department of Political Science and in the Department of Chicano-Latino Studies, where he is currently the chair. His research focuses on questions like, how do Latino immigrants move from resident to citizen to voter? Or what role do Latinos play in presidential election outcomes? Or what do Latino immigrants think immigration reform should look like? Because of his expertise in Latino voting behavior, Professor DeSipio is also well-versed in survey methodology, and that is why I have invited him to speak to us today. I myself have received sound grounding in survey research when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan. That grounding tells me that the validity of current polling methods, at least as best as I understand them, is highly suspect. But I'm an old lady and I'm out of touch, and so we need someone who can come and explain what's going on right now. So he is going to talk primarily about polling in national elections, a topic which somebody said to me nobody would be interested in after the election, which strikes me as the wrong way to look at it for sure. But he also is an expert on the Latino vote. So when we move to the Q&A, if you do have questions, not just on polling, but on Latino voting patterns, you've got an expert here, and you should take advantage of the opportunity and ask him. So please join me in welcoming DeSipio, who will discuss why we can't count on the polls.
Well, thank you very much for a very generous introduction. I'm very pleased to be here again and see some familiar faces. Just to anticipate an apology, I'm just getting over a cold, so I may have a cough at some point. I have some water nearby, and will avail myself of it if I need to. So my goal tonight is to talk about election polling, not specifically in the 2024 election, though I certainly conclude with that, but to look more broadly at how polling has been used in American elections from earlier in our history, mostly the last 100 years or so. So let me make sure that I'm doing this correctly. Did that move forward? Yes, very good. So I have two broad observations about polling, one from Shakespeare and one from Woody Allen. I think part of the fault in the way we interpret polling, and here I tap Julius Caesar, is really in ourselves. We expect and hope to get answers to the question who's going to win the election months, years in advance even, before even all the candidates are decided. And I don't think that is an appropriate thing to look for polls which were designed with a very specific purpose, to anticipate who was going to win in November in elections when most of the voting was in November. We've changed the way we've designed elections, but we haven't necessarily changed the way we think about polling. I think I also tap Woody Allen here, and shout out to Marshall Brickman, who is co-author in Annie Hall, who passed away this weekend. There's an old joke: two elderly women at a Catskill Mountain resort, and one of them says, "Boy, the food at this place is really terrible," and then the other one says, "Yeah, in such small portions." And I think that also sort of speaks to sort of the way we think about polling. We know that it isn't quite right, but we still want more of it. And we've been demanding of our institutions, the media mostly, the scholarly community to some degree, more and more pre-electoral polling, even though we know that it isn't quite right. And it wasn't quite right from the beginning. So how has polling been used in the American past? you're going to have to tell me sometime if I don't advance, because I can't quite see the screen. Polls have been there from the beginning. Candidates in the old days, when they went out on the stump, they would say something, and that got positive reaction from the audience. That was something that they moved forward with. If they got ambivalence or people leaving or looking the other way, they realized that wasn't a winning issue. So candidates have always had sort of an instinctive sense of polling. And I think we see a real dramatic example of that in our contemporary politics with Donald Trump as candidate. He's an inexperienced politician. When he entered the race in 2015, he came down that golden escalator at the Trump Tower and spoke for a little over an hour, a pattern that he certainly followed since. But one of the issues resonated, and this was something he didn't talk about until about an hour into the speech, and that was that, that he spoke ill of Mexican migrants and indicated that, they were drug dealers and, up to no good. A few of them were good people, he acknowledged, and that's what got the big response from the audience. So he, being a skilled, a new but skilled politician, realized that that was something that he had to repeat on the campaign trail. Later in that same campaign, he mentioned the wall, and that got a very positive response. So where he going into the race, probably wasn't really particularly motivated by immigration, he realized that his audience was. And I can make the argument, I'm not going to do it here, that's what he used to distinguish himself from the other primary candidates on the Republican side in 2016, what got him the nomination in a sense. We've also tried more scientifically, more social scientifically, to do pre-election polling. And the starting point that we often think to is the 1936 election. So this was the re-election of Franklin Roosevelt for the first time, the middle of the Depression. And going into that election, the one major poll that was done by a magazine, the Literary Digest, and it polled its readers, and it found that overwhelmingly Alf Landon was going to win the presidency. Alf Landon, then the governor of Kansas, and media at the time picked it up. They said, "Oh well, they must know what they're talking about. They're the literary journal. Who would question them?" Well, as we know, Alf Landon did not become the president and actually suffered perhaps one of the greatest electoral college defeats of any 20th or 21st century candidate. And now we can say, well, there's a good reason for that. The Literary Journal had a very unique subscriber base, upper income folks who had the resources to read contemporary fiction. I actually don't know what they published. And that was not a particularly good sample in our current social scientific jargon. The people that they polled were not broadly representative of the American public, so their readers might have voted for Alf Landon, but the broader public was more interested in Franklin Roosevelt. It was in the same year that George Gallup, a name whose surname you may recognize, conducted the first what we would call sort of modern election poll, and he predicted accurately that Roosevelt would win re-election. His polling went on to become sort of the gold standard of election polling. In that election, he was off by 6 points. Today, we would say, oh, that's terrible. That's outside the margin of error. But he was much closer than the Literary Digest poll, so he got the historical shout-out, the historical memory, and the Literary Digest went out of business about a year and a half later. So the 36 election and the Gallup polling begins what I call the classic period of election polling, which I say goes until about 2000. If you want to push me and say it was really 1996, you're right. I mean, around 2000. What characterized this classic period of election polling? Well, there were a few large firms, Gallup being one, Roper being another that you may have heard of. They did relatively little polling in a couple of ways. They did a national survey in the months leading up to presidential elections. They did state-level surveys in many of the states, though not all of them, in the months leading up to the election. As they moved towards the election, say in October, and voter registration deadlines in at least the early part of this period were much earlier than October, they shifted to do a likely voter poll, people that they expected might actually turn out in November, often just based on people saying that they were likely to. And then beginning in the 1960s, they began to do exit polling, meaning polling at polls at polling places in an era when almost everybody had to vote in a polling place to get a heads up early on who was actually winning the election. These were designed to be representative samples. It was bringing in the social science of the day, meaning that you had roughly the share of men and women that were in the electorate, roughly the share of young people that were in the electorate, middle-aged people, older people that were in the electorate, geographic representation, and they were weighted. And the weighting is going to come back to be a significant issue as we think about polling going forward. It was weighted so that if they happened to get too few young people, they would just make each young person worth 1.5 older people, so that the shares of the people in the sample roughly represented the share of the people in what they predicted to be the electorate. These were largely, they were exclusively nonpartisan, and they were often university affiliated. Gallup had an affiliation with Princeton, Roper with the University of Connecticut, and universities were willing to not only invest some of their resources, but also invest their sort of institutional gravitas in these polls, because they were a way of showing what social science research could do. The University of Michigan, as it becomes a powerhouse in social science, becomes a repository for many of these polls. The data were collected primarily by telephone in the pre-election period, and then at polling places beginning in the 1960s with the exit polls. These were very reliable technologies in this period. What is most important, and I think what's hardest for us to remember today, is these polling data was released very infrequently. You didn't have the sort of daily deluge of polls we get today, or hourly in some cases. 2 weeks before the election, you might get the final Gallup poll, or a week before you might get the Roper poll, and that was sufficient for people. We didn't have the such small portions concern back in the 1960s and 70s. This classic period begins to decline for a couple of reasons that I'll talk about, but I think a lot of our sort of understandings of polling and what it sort of a mythological past come from this period when there wasn't much of it, and it was relative to today, much easier to collect the data that was needed. So let's move forward. Polling in this era, I think, worked up to a point. I'm cautious, though, because this was a very different era in American politics. This period from 1936 to roughly 2000 routinely had the person who won getting about 8% more in the popular vote than the person who lost. And you might say, well, the 1964 was a blowout. Even if you take that out, you get down to 7%. So it was not as hard to predict who was going to win the popular vote in this period, because you had whoever won usually won by a sizable level. Gallup, however, mispredicted, meaning they said the other candidate was going to win in 1948, 1976, 2000, and 2004. Those were all relatively close elections. So these methodologies didn't work so well when you had a close election. Probably more importantly for who won the presidency, the electoral college margins in this era were vast. Even Bill Clinton got in the high 390s. Now we're sort of aiming for 270, and there was a strategy where Harris might have won 270 to 268, assuming she carried a district in Nebraska. In this era, the winner usually had high 300s or 400 electoral votes. So if you were doing pre-election polling in this era and missed a state, it really didn't matter, because the winner would still get a vast number of electoral votes. I remember, as a younger person, I appreciate Sue's courtesy to imply that I'm a little bit younger. I may be a little bit younger, but I'm getting up there myself. I turned 65 later this month. I remember in my 20s and 30s when I would routinely play a game with friends of guessing which Senate race would be mispredicted, because there was always one that was. There weren't the expectation that polling would be perfect, as many people seem to have today, really didn't work back then. And invariably, there would be one Senate race that would be said to go to the Democrats or said to go to the Republicans, and went the other way. And the game was predicting which one. I think some other advantages in this classic period that are not likely to be repeated is most households had phones, and at least until the 1990s, those were routinely answered when they rang. Answering machines come in that period, and that passes. A second advantage is the mainstream media, which were often paying for these polls, or at least subsidizing them, were relatively resource rich. This was before the internet. And they would pay the cost of several big polls a year and the really big cost of the exit poll. And there was a period where you actually had competitive exit polls, which is a big investment of resources. Finally, and I think this will be a recurring theme, you had a much higher trust in institutions in this period, so people were, once they answered the phone, were willing to share their perspectives on the election with an anonymous person on the other end of the phone. That willingness to participate has declined considerably. So what's changed since the early 2000s? Most of these will not come as a surprise. So the technology. Excuse me, knew that was going to happen. We screen our phone calls now in ways that we just didn't 30 years ago. Before answering machines, if the phone rang, somebody in the household generally answered it. Now, there was a problem with it was often answered by an older woman or a younger person, so you didn't get necessarily a representative sample by just calling the household, but then you could ask for somebody else, and they would find that person. Obviously, we've shifted to cell phones now, and people have been trained not to answer their cell phone unless they recognize who the call is coming in from. So we don't even recognize that we're screening polling calls today. Initially, pollsters, this was in the early 2000s, did face a problem with not being able to call cell phones because of the cost involved, and they had to come up with workarounds for that. But that has certainly passed now, and certainly any phone survey today includes a mix of landlines, with which you can get some older people, and cell phones, with which you can get some younger people. A third technological change, and this I think explains my own involvement with polling, is the rise of call centers. And these were initially used for marketing research and sales, but that could be converted or could be transitioned into pre-electoral polling. So that allowed not the biggies, not Gallup and not Roper and not the New York Times, but a group of scholars like of which I was a part, who wanted to know about the Latino vote, to do surveys particularly of subsets of the population or at local levels, where the call center would do the mechanics of that. They would make the thousands of calls that we needed to make, and we would design the survey and tell them what to do. This technology comes along in the 1990s and early 2000s, and in a sense democratizes polling. And I think that's a positive thing, but it also allows for this plethora of polls that we see in the, as we saw in 2024 and in recent elections, where you can get a poll that a polling organization that you've never heard of and that will quite likely disappear within a few months, doing a poll on some specific issue or some specific candidate. There have been certain electoral changes that I think also explain sort of the change in polling since the early 2000s. Our partisan divide is much closer now than it has ever been certainly in the period since 1936, but in the American past. So in each election, the gap between Democrats and Republicans nationally is within a few percent, and that assures that then elections will be relatively close. And certainly, if you think of the elections since 2000, then whether it's the national margin or the electoral college margin, has been much closer in the period since 2000 than it was in the 60 years before. So where a 3 or 4% margin of error in 1960 probably didn't make a difference in the accuracy of the poll, a 3% or 4% margin of error makes a considerable difference in a period like we have now, where the gap between the Democrats and the Republicans, if you include the leaners, is often 3 or 4%, and certainly at the state level is 3-4%. We see fewer battleground states now, meaning that more and more attention is focused on a relatively small subset of the American people. Even if you go back to 2000, you had 18 battleground states, 18 states that either party could reasonably have an expectation of winning. And in the last election, we did have one more than the previous. We had 7 in 2024 and 6 in 2020, but that means that all of the energy and most of the polling is going into just a relatively small geography. You have seen a dramatic growth in the electorate over the past 20, 25 years, which I think is a good thing, as a small d democratic good thing. But a growth in the electorate means it is less easy to predict who is actually going to turn out on election day. Some of that has been that we've made voting easier, which I again, think is a very positive element of American society. We've seen targeted outreach to different parts of the adult population, bringing them into the electorate, and we have seen electoral turnout rates return to historic highs. So both in 2020 and 2024, we have election turnout of the adult citizen population at rates that we hadn't seen since the early 1900s. So with more people in the electorate, it's harder to predict who will vote in a specific election. Finally, campaigns have become big business. And any of you that have looked at the data on how much it costs to run a campaign, for a congressional seat, let alone for the presidency or a statewide office, know that we're increasing by factors of 2 every election cycle. Part of that is that campaigns now think they have to have pollsters on as part of their core teams, and those pollsters create an industry for the polling firms, and it just builds out this sort of notion that we can anticipate the election in advance of the election, even though we could never do that. So the society, I think, has also changed in this period. Print media has declined, so that means there's less money for these big polls. Broadcast media has certainly expanded, but they're more, I think, interested not in understanding sort of change in the electorate, but getting sort of data points that they can report on the evening news and then forget about the next day. So there's more of an investment in polls that just focus on the horse race and not looking at sort of broader issues that may be shaping the electorate. The trust that I identified as an American value in the period from the New Deal through through 2000, give or take, has been declining, and I think that means that people are much less willing than they were before to answer a question from an anonymous person at the end of the phone, even if they answered the phone in the first place. We certainly have interest in other than the national race. I mean, my own work has been part of that. So we see a lot more targeted polls of sort of different subsets of the electorate, people with shared interests or racial or ethnic groups, polling at the local level, and I think this is driven by the campaign professional class. We have sort of a growing demand for continuous polling. We want to know what we want to know in March and April what the result of the election is going to be in November, even though most people aren't even thinking about the election yet. So we do polling very early, and then that creates a reality of its own because candidate X says, well, I'm ahead in the polls, and candidate Y is fighting back against something that may not really exist, may be sort of ephemeral. We also have the rise of the star pollster, and Nate Silver is probably the classic example of this, though Nate Cohn is, I guess you have to be named Nate to be a star pollster, but these are now the media celebrities of one of the subset of media celebrities of campaigns. The core challenge that modern polling faces, though, isn't all of these things, it's that people aren't answering their phones. So here are some data that only go through 2022. These are from the Pew Research Center. This is the percentage responses that polling firms get when they conduct election surveys. And you see in 2022 it dropped to 3%, meaning you have to make 100 calls to get 3 responded. In 2024, the media at least was saying you had to make 100 calls to get 1. I haven't seen that written anywhere, but I'm going to trust that it's true just looking at how this number has declined. There is no way you can draw a representative sample if you make 100 calls to get 1 responded. It's just the dumb luck that you would have to find exactly the right set of 400 or 600 or 1,000 people is hard to imagine. So what has replaced the phone then? Probably the worst. There is sort of an order here. The worst is so-called interactive voice or the robocall, where your cell phone will ring and for whatever reason you choose to answer it, and an anonymous, a machine-generated voice asks you if you support candidate A or candidate B. Again, very little likelihood that will lead to any valuable data, but it is a part of most polling today because it is a cheap way to build up your numbers. And you can certainly target those calls to, if you're short in other methodologies of young voters, you can target the robocalling to young voter. Similarly, many of you have received polls on your computer when you're doing something else and don't particularly want to be thinking about politics. That's internet polling. Texts are being used. Text-based polling is being used. Probably the best of these sort of newer methodologies is the panel. This is a group of people who have either opted in, that's not a good sign, or have been recruited, that's a better sign, to participate in a series of surveys about any number of things. Some can be marketing research, some can be political, I guess some can be civic kinds of things. Panels, particularly if the participants are recruited, I think can be a good resource to supplement other methodologies. The challenge, of course, is that that's expensive, and it's much easier to get a panel of people who have volunteered their own time in exchange for something. Many of you may have gotten offers from your frequent flyer programs or your civic groups that you're a part of to participate in a panel that they're constituting, and you get a reward if it's the frequent flyer program of a few miles or a few points. If it's a civic thing, your organization may get a little money. The challenge with this, of course, is that the people are not answering the questions objectively necessarily. They're answering the questions to get the reward, and this can lead to some confounding kinds of results, particularly, as I say, if you're volunteering for whatever reason unrelated to answering the questions. It's a little bit more scientific if you have been selected and asked to join the panel for a certain amount of time, because then you're being selected, at least presumably, on some demographic characteristics that are needed. Most polls are some combination of these with telephone remaining as a piece. And again, here's some data from the Pew Research Center to show sort of change in both the number of national polling organizations, they have a definition for that, and the ways in which they are compiling data across elections from 2000. And again, this only goes through 2022. What you see is what was the norm in 2000, which was exclusively telephone, almost exclusively telephone polling in 2000, is now made up much more of panel-based surveys, sometimes panel-based surveys with some phone supplements, and then some text or internet polling. With this as your input, you're less likely to get the kind of output that you need for an accurate prediction. So who's being polled? Well, with phones, of course, it's a whoever answers sort of problem. Now, in the old days, when people answered their phones, you could ask the person who answered the phone's characteristics and then say, no, I'd like to speak to your father, or I'd like to speak to a woman of the household, and that was done. And again, in an era with greater trust, and where not everybody had their own individual phone, that actually worked pretty well. Certainly, initially, the screen is for adults. Kids can't vote, so you don't want their answers to these questions. As you get closer to the election, the focus should shift to registered voters. These data are available from local registrars, so if you're doing a serious kind of poll, you can target the phone of a registered voter. You know who that is. Beginning in late August, early September, good polling firms will start screening on likely voters. The sort of lowest bar for that is asking somebody how likely you are to vote. The much better model is to look back at public records, which are available, to see how frequently that person has voted in the past. And you can target your polling to, the people who voted in 5 out of the last 6 elections, 6 out of the last 6 elections. Or if you want to make a, sort of more expansive effort, you can go into folks who have voted irregularly off and on, or only voted in presidential years, not voted in. But that is within your control as a pollster if you have the resources. The final sort of model is the exit poll. This is either telephone surveys of people who have voted, and these are available from public data early, people who submit a mail-in ballot or an early in-person ballot, or people leaving polling places. Exit polls, I think, for most of their life, were actually pretty effective at getting a sense of the electorate as a whole. They're much less effective at analyzing subgroups because the sample that is being drawn is to represent the total electorate, not where the subgroup actually lives. So in my own research, I generally don't trust the exit polls for Latinos because they generally get a lot of Latinos that live around a lot of non-Hispanic whites, the white population, which is fine, but that's not representative of the share of Latinos that are actually out there in the electorate. Anyway, these are sort of targets for different polling operations. So weighting, as I say, has been a factor in the polling process from the beginning, from 1936. Literary Digest couldn't do it. They probably didn't have a big sample of the illiterate, for example. But Gallup from the beginning would look to national data, census probably primarily in the 1930s, and make sure that their sample of the population looked sort of like the population as a whole, and where it didn't, they would adjust the sort of voice of somebody who was underrepresented to give that person a little bit more say in the average that they presented. The challenge with weighting, of course, is that not all groups are going to be equally represented, and that's all the more the case in contemporary polling where you don't have a simple methodology like the telephone to reach people. To the degree that technology, whether it's cell phones or computers, are likely are the primary way that you're reaching out to people, you're missing a subset of the population that just doesn't have access to those technologies or doesn't have access to the internet so that they can be contacted for free on those technologies. So the challenge of weighting has become all the more dramatic in the contemporary era. The risk then is that you use the small group that you get from the hard to reach to generalize to the larger population. And I think in the 2024 election, there were sort of two populations that were discussed in this way. The so-called reluctant Trump respondent who maybe didn't trust polling firms, wouldn't answer his, I guess in the stereotype, phone, and wouldn't share his opinion with the pollster because of a lack of trust. So you didn't get a true representation of people in the electorate who were likely to vote for Trump. So polls in 2016 and 2020 underrepresented Trump's ultimate share of the vote, and the explanation for this was that those people, some subset of the Trump support, would not answer their phones. There was a hope on the part of some Democrats that there was another group that might not be reached in 2024, and that was the so-called shy Harris voter. Here, stereotypically, a woman who might be in a relationship with a Trump supporter and might, in the privacy of the election booth, vote for Harris, but wouldn't admit to a pollster or say on a computer or a text that she was voting for Vice President Harris. In the end, I don't think this population actually existed, but there was some sense, and here just a graphic from 2024, of messages that were allegedly left on Post-it notes in women's bathrooms and other places where women would see them and men might not. I appreciate the fact that whoever collected these had both messages in Spanish and messages in English. As the election nears, obviously a focus, it's wonderful to know what the American public thinks, but it really doesn't matter because it's only people that vote who get a say. So you have to come up with some metric of voting likelihood, and sort of we've talked about different strategies for that, but as polls get closer to an election, you should see who they're reporting. Is it their total respondent base or those that, by whatever measure, and hopefully they've articulated that in some way, is likely to turn out in the 2024 election. In 2024, there was a new piece of data weighting that was used in a way to get this reluctant Trump respondent, and that was to ask how they remember that they voted in 2020. And the key here isn't that it's really how they voted, because whoever wins the election tends to get more in the recalled vote. But this was a way of perhaps identifying folks who might not be so comfortable admitting that they were going to support President Trump in his 2024 re-election effort, but by saying that they voted for Trump in 2020 are giving away a cue. I haven't seen any analysis of how this worked out, but I guess the broader point is that each election cycle there's some new effort to identify people who are less trusting of the polling system and less likely to answer questions about polls. What happened in 2024? Well, there were a plethora of polls. Those of you that looked at Nate Silver daily, as I probably did, or hourly, as I probably did towards the end of the race, knew that each day there were, tens of polls, whether national or state level, being released. Many of these were of dubious quality. That was also identified by Nate Silver and the other polling aggregators. The polling began very, very early, and I think this is risky on a couple of dimensions. One is people really aren't thinking about the election anywhere near as early as the pollsters or you and I are thinking about it. So you're asking people a hypothetical, and hypotheticals get a lot of retrospective evaluations, but don't have a great deal of predictive values for what's going to happen. That, however, created sort of a very early reality that then the media picked up on. The polling in 2024 obviously focused on the battleground states, and that neglected the other 43 states, which is unfortunate because it was in the other 43 that interesting things were happening. It's in those other 43 that President Trump made some of his greatest gains, or candidate Trump, President-elect Trump, made some of his greatest gains in terms of winning votes that build up his popular vote margin that now leads to the first in 3 elections where he has the largest share, a plurality probably, of the popular vote. So by focusing on the important states for the outcome, you miss a bigger picture that could have been told. We saw polling aggregation in 2024 as we had in 2020, which was an effort to sort of average the good polls with the bad polls and see if we could find patterns. And the pattern that we found, a pattern that lasts for about the final 6 weeks of the election, was not a lot of movement. From the second debate, the Harris-Trump debate, through the general election, the battleground states didn't move that much. And despite the fact that money was being poured into polling in these states. So how well did the polling aggregation do? I don't answer this question for you because I think people have widely different opinions on it. What I show you here is the poll averages, for the final day or two of the poll, and then the actual voting data. And what I see here, and you're welcome to see something else, is that in all states but Arizona, the polling data and the final data are within the margin of error, meaning the polls did as well as they could in those situations. Arizona's on the cusp of being outside of that. Not all of the data are in for Arizona, and I don't know if the late data in Arizona is narrowing that gap. So I see polls doing as good a job as we can reasonably expect them to do in an era when we have a very divided electorate and not much of a margin between the winner and the second place candidate. I think others might raise the question, well, why did all 7 states go the same way? And that's because we live in a nation, and what's happening in Arizona actually affect people in North Carolina know what's happening in, it's not, we shouldn't see each state as sort of an individual actor in this. The phenomena that are important in one state are probably important in another state. But I understand that I may be a little too pro-poll for some audiences. So what do we, assume that move forward, what should we think about going forward? Well, as long as the electorate is as divided as it is, and remember, this is in the broad history of the United States, a historically unique moment of, since 2000 roughly, where a few points divide Democrats and Republicans in terms of registration data, a few points separate the winner and the loser in terms of presidential elections. There's routine transfer of power between the Democrats and Republicans, not just in the presidency, but also in the House and Senate. Polls really can't be all that helpful for us in predicting election outcomes, and certainly polls months in advance of the election. So I would anticipate that we will see more polls because there's this insatiable demand, and the fault is ours, remember, but they will be of progressively lower quality. We're going to see increasing problems with differential non-response by different demographic groups, and that has a partisan spin since some of those groups that are least likely to respond are more likely to be in one party and advocates of that party's candidate than the other. I don't yet foresee new technologies that are sort of anticipated that will be likely to reach the quality of phone surveys from the 1970s and 1980s, the period sort of when we came into political consciousness around a lot of these things. I think polls can be very useful, even if I dismiss or if I see some limited utility in sort of predicting who's going to win in November, if that's what's being asked, in helping measure changes in issues, attitudes, and preferences. And that's where I think polls can be much better used. But who's going to put money into that, I guess? Some survey research centers. And I think we'll continue to see an increased cost of elections, meaning that there will be an increasing sort of lobbying community, advocacy community for expanding both polls within campaigns, because that creates employment within the campaigns, but then also pressing the media to do sort of, pop-up kind of polls that can then be used to advance the candidate's fundraising efforts or push a candidate out of the race, whatever the goal is. So we're going to see pressure on the media, even if the quality of the data that they're collecting is not very good. So that's my conclusion, and I hope I'm not being too pessimistic. I welcome your questions, and I'm very proud that I didn't cough too much. So thank you very much. Most of these polls that you see released, if you go to the Nate Silver aggregator or any of the other aggregators, are between 400 and 800. So 5,000 would be really quite remarkable. I would want my voice to be heard. I mean, we live in California. We're unlikely to get one of these calls. As an experiment one time, went to one of the panels, these, and it was an opt-in, so it was not a very scientific one. And I used a VPN, so I was able to tell it I lived in Nevada. And I went to the same opt-in and said I lived in California. I got no political stuff in the California, and all I was getting was political stuff in Nevada. I want my voice to be heard, actually. So were I ever to actually believe that I was getting polled by a major survey firm, I would, I'm representative of men, of people in their 60s, of college professors. I mean, I fill some boxes and would be happy to have them know that. I don't want to, people in this audience are a little older. They get a lot of people your age, my age. What they're desperately looking for is young people. So maybe tell your grandkids to answer the poll if he or she gets, or if your grandkids get called.
Is it possible to use the answers to the attitudinal questions, like right track, wrong track, favorability, to get to the candidate answer?
Not directly, but it's certainly an indicator. I mean, I'm giving, if any of you are involved in the OLLI program, I'm just coincidentally giving a talk to them on Thursday, and to me, the most important number of 2024 is the wrong track. I think that was the insurmountable barrier that Vice President Harris faced, and it was 28. Well, 28 was right track. So I think those are surrogate indicators, but candidate quality and candidate presentation, particularly in a very close electorate like we have, can surmount that. If a candidate is ahead by 60, is a 60-40 race, but the other candidate is well regarded, you're not going to overcome that gap, but you might overcome 2 or 3 points in any of these battleground states.
I'm interested in the concept of swing state, and when you aren't one, of course, how you get to be one. Are they identified early in the, sometime after April perhaps, or does it come about as a result of polling that these states look like they're more on the line? Are they always the same?
No.
Sevens, and just what's that about?
Yeah, it's not like anybody has a meeting of the swing state designating committee. It's looking at past election results, really, not just presidential, any statewide race. So any state that will routinely flip from Democrat to Republican in the governorship or in the state assembly, whatever it's called in that state, or in the presidential race that's been very close, that can be a swing state. I mean, and then the candidates get to decide, is it worth our investing our resources in this state or not. So North Carolina was the one that was added, that came to be recognized as a swing state in 2024 that hadn't been in 2020, and that was because the Harris campaign, and before that the Biden campaign, made the decision that it was close enough that they could reasonably win it, so it was worth using their limited monetary resource and limited campaign time to spend some time there. If they hadn't, even if it was that close, but they hadn't spent a dime there, then it wouldn't have been a swing state. So it's manifested by the candidates looking at data, but not necessarily looking at polling data and looking at things much more tangible. Do they shift? Yes, over time. California was a swing state in the early 1990s. It just isn't anymore.
Hi, this is what's a citizen to do question. I'm always torn about whether to respond to a poll. You know, they won't tell you who's paying for the poll. And some of them aren't really polls, so really campaigning disguised to look like polls. And do you have any advice about how one can determine whether they're really being polled or they're actually being campaigned in the guise of polls?
Sure. Well, the majors, meaning the major polling firms and the major newspapers that are affiliated with major polling firms, will identify themselves. So if you get a call from somebody saying they're New York Times Siena, and they seem vaguely literate on the other side of the phone, I'd probably believe them. Certainly a lot of the local polls are what are called push polls, trying to give you information that makes you more likely to vote a certain way, often a way that is against the questions that you're getting. I mean, by the way the questions are designed. I guess what I do, since I get some of those, I did when I had a landline, I guess I haven't gotten them since I got the cell phone, is to go answer a few questions and get my sort of sense of the science that I think they're using, and if I think they're trying to cheat me, I just hang up on them. I don't feel bad about that. So, but a major will identify themselves, and I've never, I guess there probably is a case of people lying about being major polling firms, but I haven't heard, I don't know that story.
Hi, I'm going to ask a question. I don't know about anybody else, but I get a poll fatigue. You know, I mean, it starts early and it goes on, and you're bombarded with different polls, and finally you just, get fatigued.
Yeah.
I mean, is there any way to counter that?
Well, I mean, ultimately, you have to take responsibility. Now, I would not answer early ones because I don't think they're very valuable. I would, if I know that I'm going to get polled repeatedly, and which I don't have that advantage, I would wait until the election is actually on and there's something serious that I believe other people would know something about. Because again, if you do a poll in February of a hypothetical race between two candidates who haven't even been nominated yet, most people don't really have a strong, I mean, they have an opinion, but it's not a well-grounded opinion.
How do polls calculate your margin of error?
It's based on the number of respondents that they have, and it's a statistical calculation based on sort of what the chance is based on that number of respondents that they will have hit, that the average that they're reflecting is reflective of the true data. Now remember, so there are two statistics that you need to know. One is almost all polls have about a 5% chance, even if they're collected with all the science in the world, have about a 5% chance of just being completely wrong. And the example that we have of that from 2024 was that Iowa poll that was released a day or two before the election. The pollster, very responsible person, has been doing polling of Iowa for years. Iowa, you can still do phone polls because enough people have phones. She was just off. And 5% of the time, that's going to happen. Then the second piece of data that you need is sort of how far around that average, which is what is reported, what is the range around that midpoint that could reasonably be predicted based on the total size of the survey. And generally with a survey of about 400, which is the low end of what anybody would report, it's somewhere between 4 and 5%. If you get up to 800, it's more like 3 or 4%. And if you do 1,100, which is in the old days what Gallup and Roper and all used to do in their final poll the week or two before the election, you get down to about 2% around that average. So it is an acknowledgement, sort of from the classic days of polling, that even if they do everything perfectly, they're going to be a little bit off. And we've sort of missed that in the modern era.
Suppose we had no polls. I'm thinking of the amazing amount of money that's spent on these.
And to what use are they actually?
Yeah.
I understand you're pro-polling, but what use are they actually?
Well, as I say, I think they can capture some important knowledge about attitudes and values that are not collected on.
That's the thing that was least important, that the polls that you mentioned.
Well, I don't know if they're least important, it's least reported.
Reported.
Yeah. So, I think we want to capture change in the electorate, and the only way that, since, an election is by definition a point in, or a month in time now, it used to be a point in time, we want to see sort of where that change is coming from and then be able to extrapolate from that where it might be leading. And that's what the attitudinal data in well-collected polls can tell you. It may not get written up the next day in the New York Times, but people that analyze that data use it to do what they should be doing. That said, I sort of take your concern that part of the reason that we have a lot of polls is that there is a whole industry around polling within campaigns, and it's a way of further building out campaigns and taking more of the money that we contribute to them, and sucking that into the campaign campaign business. I don't. Certainly, under current rulings from the Supreme Court, I don't think there's any way we can sort of, defund the campaigns. And as long as we're funding them at the levels, we're going to have that kind of polling.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. We appreciate it. Thank you for a very interesting talk. When I look at the exit polls from this election, this is kind of a specific question. What I see is one of the huge groups that deserted the Democratic Party were Catholic voters. Joe Biden carried Catholic voters in 2020. Kamala Harris even cracked 40%, according to the exit polls. But the interesting thing to me is I don't hear anybody talking about that.
Yeah.
So I wonder, am I missing something? Are people talking about it, or if they're not, why?
Yeah.
It seems to me to be a lot bigger change than the ones we heard about, black people allegedly deserting the Democrats, and which didn't happen. Hispanic men, which did happen.
Yeah.
This is a lot more voters.
Well, I guess the Catholic vote has been more fluid over time. I mean, Biden obviously did well as our second Catholic president, but Catholics have supported Republicans in the past. I guess a significant share of today's Catholic vote are Latinos, and their movement away from the Democrats was sort of seen as a Latino working class move rather than a move as Catholics. The evangelical community has sort of long been part of the Republican coalition, and that surprised some people because of President Trump's sort of unique relationship to religion. But they've been loyal and continue to be. So, the non-Hispanic white working class vote, moved to some degree, at least in the younger ones. They may not be practicing Catholics, but they may answer a question that they're Catholic if you're asked on a poll or asked on an exit survey, exit poll.
Well, I think that you partially answered my question, because I was going to ask how accurately did the polls predict the Latino vote? Because I wasn't following the polls, but I was quite surprised by the outcome of the Latino vote. And some people said it was a business type of move, and that Latinos are very concerned about small businesses and things like that.
That might be part of it.
But what is your take on that?
Well, there has been sort of a steady move away from the Democrats from 16 to 20 to 24 among Latinos. As somebody that's thought about this for a while, I think it's been a failure of outreach. Hillary in 16 didn't do a very good job of reaching out to anybody, but she particularly didn't do a good job of reaching out to Latinos. So you have, an electorate that grows every 4 years because it's a younger population. It also has people naturalizing and becoming eligible to vote. So she didn't reach out to them, where Trump was a major figure, a figure that absorbed a lot of media attention. So that brought some in. Biden in 2020 and the Democrats made the choice not to reach out to anybody because of the pandemic. The Republicans did a slightly better job and did some door knocking in Arizona and Nevada. So they brought in sort of more. And then in 2024, you have the sort of economic pressures that moved a lot of non-college educated voters into the Republican camp, and that included Latinos. So, but your question was really, did the pre-election polling capture this? It depends. There's pre-election polling that's done by people that don't understand the Latino community, and pre-election polling that's done by people that do understand the Latino community. The pre-election polling done by people who do understand the Latino community actually did a pretty good job. The sort of mass polling firms that pulled together a Latino sample and didn't make it very representative of the Latino community didn't do a very good job. That said, I don't quite trust the exit poll because exit polls really aren't designed to get a good measure of subgroups of the electorate. The better data that will give us a sense of what really happened is the validated voter surveys, which will come out in early 2025. And though they're not point estimates, what I suspect they will show is that a lower share of Latino men moved to Trump than the exit poll showed. Doesn't mean that there wasn't a movement, it just isn't quite as dramatic as the exit poll suggested.
All right, and this is then I'll address the exit polling question. Is there, I mean, the states are obviously collecting the data, so wouldn't there be a possibility that the states, the Secretary of States could release the data without releasing the names?
Oh yeah, oh no, yeah, they do. Those data they charge a little bit. And that's why a couple of national firms collect it all and then make it available to others. So yeah, I mean, if you could go to the Orange County Registrar of Voters and get those data, and the cost would probably be nominal, but there are 3,000 counties in the United States, so you really need somebody to do it, on a larger scale. And there are two big firms that do that, but that's why it takes a little while to sort of collect it. We're not done counting votes yet, so we know who voted, and we know what the vote was in each precinct, and then we do some statistical guesswork. I mean, good guesswork. Because we want to know on election night. Yeah, no, exit polls were designed for one purpose, and then they're widely misused after that. It was so that Walter Cronkite or Chet Huntley or whoever could say, and we're calling the election for at 8:02 p.m. That's the only reason we have exit polls, but they've sort of taken on a life of their own. And I want to know on election night what's going on, but I also want to know the more rigorous data afterward.
We hear about all the public polls, but we also hear that there's internal polls.
Yeah.
How do they differ from the public polls,
Yeah.
and how do they differ? And do we have any evidence as to whether they're better? Is there some secret sauce?
Yeah. The goal of the internal polls is not to give the simple answer who's going to win this state or who's going to win this congressional district. It's how are we doing with this electorate and how are they responding to this message. So it's more tactical, and I think consequently it is more accurate because it's answering a narrow question that can be answered with those data. And I thought it was very important. I, like many of you probably, was just addicted to podcasts in the period leading up to the election, and you'd hear analysts from both the Democrats and the Republicans saying, our internals are showing X. And some of that is spin. But if you'd hear it from the other side, like the Democrats saying the Republican internals are saying X, or then I'd believe it a little bit more. And they were generally the sort of what I remember of them, they tended to be more precise in the way I wanted them to be. So yeah, those internal polls are very useful. But should a campaign be, guiding everything on how a specific message works, or should they be thinking about what is the message they want to send to the American people or, congressional district, whatever? That becomes the challenge.